The presentation today basically focuses, if you wish, on issues of on design issues that relate, to the management of heritages of trauma and death, it looks into scholarly debates, where heritages of trauma and death discuss, or use a variety of sensory metaphors to discuss how we publicly engage with that type of cultural phenomena. So I'm looking, for those of you who are familiar, with the literature I'm talking about, I'm looking, at a literature that uses metaphors of darkness and dissonance and deviation, to enrich heritage definitions, and try to define, these particular types of heritages, and then I'm trying to establish a connection between the heritage theory, and the heritage practice, the design practice. The two questions, that we will be working with today is, where do these metaphors, if you wish, that we employ in order to manage by design these traumatic heritages, and these cultures of death, where do they stem from? And also, how do these cognitive architectures affect, if you wish, the material ones? The methodology, as I said, comes from cognitive studies, so I adopting a cognitive linguistics approach and methodology. The paper, sketches out the experiential and cultural grounds of the three sensory metaphors I've just mentioned, and which are not random. They populate densely, books and journal articles that focus on heritages of trauma and death. And we'll see again the relationship between, theory and practice, cognitive architectures, and material ones. And of course, in order to establish that connection, we will be looking at the shortlisted entries, a number of shortlisted entries, from the competition on the UK Holocaust Memorial and Learning Central in London. A few information on the case study, if you wish. So for those of you who don't know, back in January 2014, David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, initiated the works of a cross-party committee that looked at essential measures, in action to enhance the commemoration of Holocaust atrocities by the British society. The report published by the Holocaust Commission a year later was named Britain's Promise to Remember, and it suggested that the making of a Holocaust Memorial and a learning center was essential for the preservation of the survivors' testimonies. Bear in mind that we are in the last decade that survivors of the Holocaust actually, are able to transfer directly, their experience, and that, has put extra pressure, if you wish, on institutions to preserve these testimonies. In November 2015, 50 sites were proposed as potential locations, which were all disqualified as unsuited. These discussions were followed by an alternative proposal to design and build the memorial at the foot of the British Parliament in Victoria Tower Gardens. For those of you who don't know, Victoria Tower Gardens are a grade 2 listed heritage site. It's a social hub and a community park, at the centre of London. In January 2016, an international competition was announced for the project on that same location, the exact location, and it was managed and launched by Malcolm Reading Consultants. In 2016, in November of 2016, after a scrutinous review, and voting process, 2 proposals were shortlisted from a pool of 92 entries, and David Ajay, Ron Arad, Gustafsson, and Porter and Baumann were granted the first award. As the awarded design proposal was further developed, various stakeholders and individuals expressed concerns about it. Just to name a few: London Parks and Gardens Trust, Historic England, the UK branch of ICOMOS, the Westminster Council, a number of prominent, individuals and academics who were focusing on Jewish history and culture. They had their oppositions not about the project, but about the way, it was coming into life, if you wish. And concerns escalated, to a point that the Westminster Council actually rejected the planning application. And in a checkmate move, if you wish, in November 2019, the Housing Minister decided to call in the planning application for determination at national level because of the project's significance. Planning permission was finally granted not by Westminster Council, but by the Minister of Housing, Communities and Local Government in July 2021, so almost 6 or 7 months ago, and the construction was announced, of the project with a deadline being autumn 2024, if that hasn't changed. Now, having said all that, the center of the presentation today obviously is not, to scrutinize the discontent around, the design competition, or to interrogate the call, the process, etc. The project has, the ability to gather the interest of practices and architects and theorists, that have been working with similar heritages and difficult commemoration in various other occasions. And as such, it accumulates, if you wish, or it allows us to distill the different design strategies that come into work, in this type of commemoration, this type of heritages. To talk a bit about the methodology, if you wish. So for the past 2 millennia, metaphors have been discussed as linguistic phenomena. They were discussed as decorations, violations of semantic rules, transfers from one genus or species to another, vehicles of meanings, and so on. But for cognitive scientists, and linguists, for a particular team of them, metaphors were cognitive scaffoldings, conceptual frameworks, neural mappings. So metaphors were, if you wish, thinking processes, not linguistic phenomena. And there are obviously the only thinking processes we have that allows us to conceptualize and interpret, phenomena that are complex or are not directly experienced, like knowledge, memory, culture, and so on. Most interestingly, the same pool of people, for the same pool of people, metaphors are experientially and culturally grounded, and we'll translate that. We'll see what that means. They are established and strengthened by our bodily experience in the culturally shaped realms we live in. So language does not produce metaphors. I mean, that's the crucial point to remember here. It's the bodily experience that brings them to life, and they're only reflected in language. That's what the methodology proposes in a way. Let's talk about the experiential grounds. So Christopher Johnson, a cognitive psychologist and theorist, suggests that in the early stages of childhood, subjective and sensory motor experience are conflated. So for example, when an infant is held in his or her mother's arms, the sensory motor experience of warmth is gradually conflated with the subjective experience of love. A strong correlation is established between the two domains, the subjective and the experiential one, love and warmth, if you wish, and then they tend to work as one. In later development stages, the two domains, are differentiated. We're able to recognize that love is not warmth and so on. However, they tend to, to be co-activated. And Joseph Grady calls this, strong associations or connections primary metaphors, and Johnson and Lakoff calls the metaphors we live by. This is also an interesting, reference for those of you who are interested in synesthesia, about how synesthetic, synapses are created. Primary metaphors have a very simple structure, and they are constitutional units of more complex ones. And here is a selection of metaphors that are established through our bodily experience and are very relevant, to design studies. And I'm sure, as architects, you will appreciate it. So we tend to understand, important, happy, and healthy as an upward condition. Similarity as closeness, difficulty as a burden, or a sense of disorientation. Knowing is often discussed, and conceptualized as seeing, especially in Western cultures. Seeing is seen as touching, understanding as grasping. We say, I get your idea, I get what you're saying. Time is often discussed as space, so we move into time, the journey of life and so on. Change is seen as motion. When something is moving, we understand that it changes. Events are discussed as locations and so on. Now imagine the implications of these simple metaphors, let's say in the design of an exhibition, when we actually cluster exhibits, for example, or when spaces come together of similar uses, when things acquire, larger, dimensions, when they're important and so on. So this is, if you wish, a cognitive translation of implicit decisions. Lakoff and Johnson suggest that myths, now talking about the cultural grounds, Lakoff and Johnson suggest that myths are for culture what metaphors are for cognition. Allegoric and systematic, they work as abbreviated interpretations of complex cultural phenomena. As cultural conditions change, contemporary myths or dominant discourses, philosophies, theories, and so on, change, and also the metaphors that shape them. And from such a culturally contingent cognitive perspective, ancient and contemporary myths of cultural heritage are discussed in this presentation. So cognition here is a cultural phenomenon as well. It's not just, is not biologically discussed in a way. Ancient and contemporary myths or discourses allow us to identify the cultural grounds of the sensory metaphors we will focus on today, and that we tend to use, when we try to manage heritages of trauma and death. And here you can see, two engravings, one from the Platonic cave and one from the labyrinth. The two schemata will have, will play an important role in our analysis later on. So sensory metaphors summoned to definitions, of heritages of trauma and death, built their complexity upon, dead metaphors or metaphors we live by. A very common one is that we see culture as a heritage, a form of inheritance. So the later definitions, dark heritage, difficult heritage, dissonant heritage, they build on that presupposition that culture is a form of inheritance. The culturalist heritage metaphor is experientially grounded on our tendency to conceptualize immaterial qualities as contained and transferable. So we transfer ideas, we transfer values, values are contained in artifacts and so on. Since the invention of the term, new disciplinary and theoretical contexts challenged, these definitions and expand their meaning, but also confirm the dominance of the culturalist heritage metaphor. So culture is still discussed as heritage, for the past, let's say, 50 or 60 years. But it has been, also defined as a civilizing ritual, a play, a stage, a performance, a cognitive ecology. So there are more complex metaphors that are built, on that basic one. These alternative definitions built on the changes movement metaphor, a primary metaphor that allows us to conceptualize change in heritage, because up to the let's say the 90s, 70s, and 80s, we tend to think of heritage as something static, something we need to conserve. But actually, when we move forward, when we get into the 90s, and to the third millennium, we actually start to understand that, there's a resilience, and change, in heritage, and these new metaphors come into that play. Talking about dark heritages and where that darkness comes from in a way. Dark interpretations of trauma and death are as old as humanity. They build upon the knowing is seeing, but also that life is light metaphors. The term dark heritage is coined by John Lennon and Malcolm Foyle, and it comes to us through tourism literature, actually, not from heritage theory. It densely populates academic discussions on the commemoration of trauma and death in the late 1990s. And the same authors propose a taxonomy of localities with various shades of darkness. And basically, the model there is that, the time and the spatial distance, of the visitors from the events of trauma and death is directly translated into shades of darkness. And here you can see, a number of obviously, there's no expectation for you to engage with all these quotes at the moment, but there is basically evidence about how prominent is the metaphor when we discuss heritages of trauma and death, and also of the particular spatial qualities that we attribute to it. More interesting variations emerge when one attempts to sketch out, the complex architectures that support darkness in these discourses. These become evident in the relevant literature you see on your screen. And a safe assumption to make is that the main special reference here is the theatrical stage, a theatrical space. So, for example, Bauman and Petullo say, that dark heritage, that sites of trauma and death, are devoid of actors and performances. The theater has gone dark. That's the metaphor they used to talk about to define that heritage. And of course, the list of heritage articles and books and reports that make use of the theater, metaphor is endless, as you might know from memory literature. In the dark heritage literature, the theater is repeatedly mentioned as a light apparatus, but its cognitive spell is more complex than that. Heritage localities are thought and designed as strictly delineated in time and space, so they have clear boundaries. The theater is a space, the stage is a space, needs to be defined. They're structured around a variety of binary perceptions, so we have backstage and front stage spaces, stages and auditoriums, theater and the world, past and present. So in this conceptual frame, dark heritages are defined in opposition to luminous ones. They are the heritages that are condemned by dominant historical narratives into darkness. That's, the rationale of the definition. Burnbridge and Ashworth discuss the experience of sites that support memories of trauma and death as dissonance, so a different sensory metaphor here, one that relates to sound. Metaphors of dissonance build their understanding on our bodily experience of sound and harmony. Sound is metaphorically understood as a moving liquid matter, or entity, a wave, and harmony from the Greek word harmonia is etymologically has an etymological reference to the join, and the fitting, armos, the liminal space where two areas firmly meet together. So metaphors of sound make use of the changes movement metaphor, just because we conceptualize sound, as a type of movement, and of similarities, closeness when we talk about harmonious, or disharmonious, dissonant heritages. So dissonant heritages speak of an aharmonious, distant interpretations of culture, interpretations that do not match or fit well, they're also well aligned with our experience of sonic performances. So we have a space there, a performance space hiding in that metaphor, if you wish. Dissonant heritages are also discussed as contested, and here, likewise, as we did with the dark heritage definitions, here is an accumulation, of definitions of dissonant heritage that use, sonic phenomena to define, heritages of trauma and death. A collective volume edited by Helene Silverman, Lozarine Smith, Turnbridge, and Ashworth is indicative of these emerging definitions. Silverman suggests that dissonance and contestation are intrinsic to heritage, so they're co-present at all the time. And if dissonance implies a sonic performance, contestation is a term of French origin that talks about a juridical examination, the new testimonies that challenge earlier ones, or more widely accepted ones. So if darkness and dissonance are cognitively supported by architectures of dramaturgy, of theatrical plays, of sonic performances, contestation implies a different kind of stage, echoing Goffman here, Erwin Goffman, a stage of juridical performances where the script actually becomes more important than, the action itself, our light. William Logan, moving to the difficult heritages, which is the third very popular, definition we see, when we discuss heritages of trauma and death. William Logan and Keir Reeves choose to speak of difficult heritages instead. The metaphorical understanding of difficulty is linked to our sense of weight and orientation, which is essentially linked, to movement. So this is why how we map movement and how we record it is of paramount importance here. Difficult heritages built their complex meaning primarily upon the easy, straight, lightweight. It's okay. So difficult heritages built the complex meanings primarily on the easy, straight, or lightweight, and difficult is puzzling or burdenous. These are the metaphors that they work with. And of course, the other additional metaphors that underlines all these very complex ones is that understanding is grasping, All this matrix unfolds because our sense of balance and orientation is linked to gravity, to our sense of weight. So that's the experiential grounds, if you wish, of the metaphor. Gravity and weight also share the experiential grounds of grief. So the word grief is etymologically connected to the Latin gravare, which means to be heavy, to feel heavy. So there's a very close experiential connection between, grief and our sense of weight. Difficult heritages signify diversion from the burdenless or straightforward commemorations to burdenous or puzzling ones. In their book, More Than Cool Reason, Lakoff and Turner discuss the predominance of metaphors of play and drama in poetic and everyday interpretations of life. Metaphors have the ability to cast light on certain structures, conceptual structures, thinking structures, and to cast shadow on others. So the metaphor itself transforms, to reflect changes, in contemporary myths or philosophical discourses, and it can be quite selective about it. According to their account, sociology, philosophy, and heritage theory record a change from theatrical metaphors that work as light apparatuses to performance metaphors who bring attention to script and enactment. In this metaphorical journey, cultural heritage definitely has become more inclusive and more adaptive and subject to change as well. Yet it's still staged, it's still well defined, and therefore it is often discussed as binary phenomena. And for those of you who had the appetite, to indulge, in structuralist and post-structuralist writing like Butler and etc., you can tell that there is a very clear, binary structure that underlines, our understanding in these theories. Such dual thinking, is challenged when metaphors of weight and orientation, are summoned to support our understanding of death cultures and traumatic heritages, simply because the cognitive architectures that we summon to understand them are quite different from the stage. We said that difficulty is experientially grounded in our encounter with less straightforward or puzzling settings. So the question is, if the theatrical metaphor, was supporting darkness, and dissonance, what's the metaphor? What's the special reference here when we talk about disorientation, or deviation and so on? And the cultural response here is the maze, the labyrinth. Maysian theatrical conceptualizations of memory follow parallel trajectories from the archaic era to postmodernity for Western thought, although one is more advertised than the other, if you wish. A relationship is lost around the 18th century, a period we often discuss as European Enlightenment, and which not accidentally gives life to culture's heritage metaphor. Penelope Reed Dupe picks the abandoned thread of the maze from the classic antiquity and delivers it to the Middle Ages, when the maze as a motive, a metaphor, and an idea symbolizes particular ethical and aesthetical qualities in religious architectures, but primarily in writing, in discourse, in literary pieces of work. In this dark medieval context, universal labyrinths become emblematic of God-sent salvation, and puzzling mazes, are used to discuss the painstaking but cathartic recollection. So mazes and labyrinths become less popular during Enlightenment and re-emerge in late modernity in the works of surrealists in exile, of cubists that wish to escape dominant stylistic morphologies, and in the architectural works of purists. Think about Le Corbusier and his labyrinths, and Swiss competition and so on. Mazy metaphors will witness a revival in the networks and rhizomes in postmodernity, in theories that focus on cultural ecologies and knowledge networks. In these later manifestations, mazes or rhizomes work as conceptual models for complex urban and cultural phenomena, where one does not get lost in darkness or dissonance, but in repetition and homogeneity. So we witness a passage from theories that are built upon oppositions to theories that work with similarities. That's an interesting point here. And obviously, they have an effect on heritage theory, and design theories. To appreciate how cognitive architecture shape materials one, we will now look at the selection from the shortlisted, entries. So I think I've skipped. To appreciate how cognitive architecture shape material ones, we will now look at the selection from the shortlisted entries of the design competition for the UK Holocaust Memorial, led by Malcolm Reading Consultants. And due to time limitation, we'll just look at 4 or 5, examples that showcase how these dominant metaphorical schemata shape, the design concept and its communication. A few words about the call here, keywords. The call for the competition was advocating for an architecture that stands against prejudice and hatred, an architecture that inspires reflection and compassion, that encourages present and future generations to respect and embrace difference, an architecture that helps us develop a deeper understanding of how societal breakdown can lead to genocide, an architecture that is emotionally powerful while offering visitors an opportunity to deepen their understanding of humanity's darkest hours. So the metaphors, come to us through the call, and also they almost demand for an empathetic approach, to design. And here you can see one of the shortlisted entries, Zaha Hadid Architects and Anish Kapoor proposal was conceived as a subterranean passage developed around a hovering bronze cast meteorite, a stone of tremendous weight, which lies at the heart of the memorial. The organically shaped monolith works as the symbolic metonymy for sudden and impactful events that almost eliminate the life of Jewish European communities. Commemoration of atrocities is staged here as a subterranean darkened habitation, but also as a burdenous encounter with traumatic heritage. Cypress trees are very much associated with death localities and cemeteries across Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions around the Mediterranean Sea. Likewise, stones are very emblematic artifacts for Jewish commemorating rituals. In liquid or solid formation, they work as symbolic metonymies of burdenous traumatic memories of war, conflict, genocide, exile, and so on. So these are, the stone has a particular, symbolic meaning for the Jewish traditions. Most Holocaust memorials are indicative of this cultural tendency, this design tendency. However, here, the weight is a metaphor, for the unbearable grief and trauma. So gravity is not used, as a way to communicate disorientation, as we said previously, but is used as a grounding device, a grounding design device, a metaphor for submitting or resisting historical destinies, if you wish, or historical atrocities. Movement around and towards the meteorite is staged as a burdenous subterranean inhabitation, but as in classic Western myths and theatrical practice, in Hadid and Kapoor's proposal, dramaturgy calls for catharsis, a process that restores not happiness, but truth, justice, or inner peace. And as such, while from the outside the meteorite works as a metaphor for burdenous heritages, once you enter it, it becomes a hollow negative space, a shadowy chamber, an invert Platonic den, where the mnemon, the visitor, the person who remembers, is no longer deceived by darkness and shadow, but finds consolation and peace in this smooth ambient light. That's the opposition, that's the transition from trauma, to reconciliation. The project acquires visceral qualities and evokes our empathy by focusing on two primary design metaphors. The difficulty is weight and darkness is death metaphors. The dominance of more cultural schemata and therefore of design tendencies will start to be even more, obvious once we look at the following, shortlisted entries. The commemoration of trauma and death as a dark subterranean journey that safely returns us to life, light, surface is a very, very old Western myth and is captured in our classic philosophy and in Christian doctrines, but also, it's the key design metaphor for the longest shadow entry, which is an entry submitted by Studio Libeskin and Haptic Architects. The designers introduced the scheme as the empathetic device that eventually allows us to stand, as they say, in the shadow of the scar, up in the air. Again, the trauma metaphor is very, present here, and the darkness metaphor is here as well. Light and darkness, ascent and descent, confinement and subterranean caverns, and return to life, light, surface are the primary design devices, and cultural predispositions that shape the project. And reading a quote, from the architects, from the team itself, the memorial communicates a shadow that has been cast forever on the history of civilization. Visitors carry this shadow with them as they journey underground. A dark, reflective metal plane cuts into sky. The visitors walk down a white timber ramp, passing through this plane into the underground. Once inside, the visitor descends into darkness along a continuous trajectory, the path illuminated by light cast from the contents of the exhibition. Within this darkness, there is a single track, the path of hope. I mean, that's how we walk through that project, which elevates the visitor back to the world, culminating in a platform pier that is overlooking Thames. Darkness here is the main design concept, the main strategy for achieving reflection and contemplation, for commemorating the darkest hour of humanity, if you remember, the call of the competition. And again, you can see here the plan, the side plan, and also, some interior renderings, of that passage. And again, in this subterranean journey, we are received as a group. You remember we have a big, plane ramp that takes us underground, but we return to the surface as individuals. So as we escape, that subterranean passage, we return as individuals. We enter as a group, we return as individuals. And think again of Plato's cave, and start to understand, how deeply cultural are these tendencies. In Plato cave, living in the shadow is a group, is a collective state of being, and actually escaping to light is a very personal journey. So it is the individual, the single body that fights for redemption, catharsis, and reconciliation, and it's the collective one that supports illusion and prejudice. That's the cultural predispositions that shape the proposals. How strong these cultural metaphorical models are becomes evident in yet another shortlisted competition entry. This is Foster and Partners and Michael Rovner's proposal, which is developed as a path to a very, very literal theater of shadows this time, which again talks about the gradual descent to a den of digital projection. So this time there's a digital projection that awaits for us there. Here the memorial is organized around Rovner's video installation, the vague projection of drawing studies, a contemplation on kids' experience of death camps. The video installation speaks of the vague memories of childhood and of an innocence that perseveres even in the darkest hours of humanity. Here, hope and redemption is a lesson offered by the most innocent and dead, and therefore it's impossible to ignore. And again, we tend to experience it as a group. So here is the main space, it's the main space of reference, the heart of the memorial. But again, the return to the surface, to light and to life, is choreographed, through narrow paths, along a painstaking journey of the individual. And here you can see again, especially in the last two photographs, how, again, we return, through narrow paths back to Thames, back to the park. And of course, the whole subterranean idea relates very much, to restrictions set by the competition about the Victoria Park, the Victoria Garden Park, and trying to respect green spaces as well, etc. So there's a discussion between the cultural tendencies, if you wish, and what the site itself calls for us to do. All three proposals orchestrate their experience of commemoration of Holocaust atrocities around a theater of shadows, an introverted subterranean space where traumatic memories are projected, often in an elusive or vague way, or that supports our peaceful reflection and contemplation. These introverted chambers, designed to support different shades of darkness, do not only support a cyclical journey from life to death, and again, back to life, they're also shaped by one of our strongest Western prejudice, if you wish, that illusion, deception, and prejudice are the result of our collective existence, and truth, knowledge, and catharsis are personal revelations. And this is all very much distilled, in the architecture proposals we've seen so far. Looking into the same pool of shortlisted competition entries, The Ear by the Irish architects Hennigan, Peng, and Sven Andersson explores dissonance as integral to commemoration. So the memorial is an ear that connects, let me see if the next slide is, it also includes the quote. The memorial is an ear that connects visitors with the voices and testimonies of those who experienced the Holocaust. Set within the individual voids that occupy the walls of the memorials, their sonic aggregate becomes the primary material of its sensory construction. So here, it's sound and dissonance, that shape the architectural experience in the design proposal. Dissonance is culturally grounded in various mourning and lamenting rituals, so in Eastern and Southern Europe, but also, in all these cultures, the Jewish culture around the Mediterranean lake. Mourning is by definition a dissonant song, this is a harmonious song, a song that interrupts the harmonious rituals and performances of life. It is a break, in the harmony of life. This is how, dissonance heritages come together. Moving further in time, dissonance is also an inherent quality in the narratives of the dead, but also, in traumatic ones. So trauma, comes, in literature, it pops up as a condition that it cannot be fully perceived, and there's a lot of, a contestation about it, if you wish. In archaic oracles, dissonance and fragmentation define the sonic experience of the messages that the dead leave for the living. When the latter engage in these dark subterranean spaces, in classic traditions, for example, these are spaces, underground spaces, where the visitor enters intoxicated. So sound is by definition, if you wish, dissonant and so on. Let me see. Yeah, and here you can see the main chamber. And in classic literature, these chambers are called adita. These are the spaces basically that the dead meet the living, and they exchange secret, they share the secrets. These archaic places and rituals are unwillingly restaged in the ear design entry, which evolves as a gradual exposure to the fragmented Holocaust, to the Holocaust narratives. These spaces have no obvious access. So if you go back, at the and you look, at the site rendering, it's not easy to identify how you enter that space. And again, that's not, that's culturally contingent. The spaces where actually the living meet the dead always have a hidden entrance in a way. These spaces, darkness is still present in these spaces. It doesn't, circumscribe the stage, but it creates an ambient atmosphere that enhances the dissonant experience. So the ear is conceived as a sonic threshold where the murmurs of the dead merge with the noise of the city. And let's get to the awarded proposal now. The awarded proposal, designed by David Adjaye and Ron Arad, seems to weave in all these models, but also to challenge their dominant narratives. With the main exhibition halls conceived again as a series of subterranean caverns where difficult historical truths are revealed, the design of the reception and the contemplation hall holds strong references to disorientation and deviation. And this is, how the entrance, the reception to the memorial looks, from the park's view. I want to show you how it looks from the inside, but also the contemplation space, and we'll start to discuss these ideas now. Is there a maze that shapes Adjaye's proposal? I suggest, obviously, that there is and one that defines, it doesn't define every aspect of the project, but it defines, its key points. A maze, however, in Adjaye's proposal, sees life as a shared event, and trauma and death as a bewildering passage and isolation. So we have a reverse reading, to the previous one. These ideas become more clear in the conceptual sketches that accompany timidly the submitted proposal, and which include references to the Hebrew flame calligraphy. So here you can see, one of the templates submitted for the competition by the design team, and I've only enlarged, you see some conceptual sketches. This is how the architect called them, you know, at the left corner. You know, I've just enlarged some of these images so that you have an understanding of what they're talking about. And the main references here, declared references, are the Hebrew flame calligraphy, the torn pages of the Jewish books, you know, during the Kristallnacht pogrom in 1938, and the western wall tunnels of the Temple Mount, which again is a passage, you know, in the walls, in the Jerusalem walls. The wandering element of Jewish history and religion, the bewildering exiles and the straightforward exodus, the merge of paths and stories in the sacred text of Hebrew traditions are some of the key points that shape the project. Contrary to the previous entries, the awarded proposal receives us to traumatic past as individuals, so we have a reverse, you know, approach to our reception. And it then guides us into a series of exhibition halls and leaves us wandering in a fragmented narrative space of contemplation before it actually returns us, you know, to present, to life, to democracy as a collective body. Fractured experience retrospectively shared is actually the title that the architectural team gives to the project or to the experience. Here the maze does not define our entrance and access to historical information, it supports our contemplation. The fragmented entrance and maze exhibition hall by Ajay and Arad evokes memories of the Garden of Exile and Immigration in Berlin's Jewish Museum, designed by Daniel Libeskind, but it predominantly, it brings to mind the much debated Berlin Holocaust Memorial by Richard Serre and Peter Eisenman. Either as a reception or as an exit, the maze reactivates the disorientating feeling of loss and, you know, that trauma and loss leave behind, you know, and also it helps us understand of atrocities, of historical traumas as a state beyond reason. When the maze becomes the reception, we run the risk of losing our way, of missing, you know, the key points of the narrative, of missing our empathetic advantage. And remember all the criticism that the project, you know, the Berlin the Holocaust Memorial project had undergone, exactly because the visitors had a playful approach to it, you know. On the contrary, when it signifies the end, as is the case, you know, in the Jewish Museum, it becomes a safe place for contemplation, a metaphor for exile and diaspora, a device to reconnect with what humanity has lost. The winning proposal of the London Holocaust Memorial seems to follow a shift in heritage definitions and theories that we discussed in the first part of the presentation, a shift that derives references from philosophical, sociological, and cognitive debates on memory and forgetfulness. The gradual shift we witness in Western literature from the archaic adita and the Platonic caverns, you know, to the Renaissance theaters of memory and to the stages of postmodernity, you know, is very parallel to the ones that the Aristotelian labyrinth takes, you know, when it transforms to medieval mazes, you know, to the new materials networks, for example, or to the rhythms, you know, of Deleuze and Guattari. These journals are interweaved. They shape our design strategies and empathetic mechanisms, and under very particular conditions or occasions, they may compete against each other, and one might persevere, but that all relates as well to the context, to the historical time as well. The presentation opened the discussions. I'm trying to summarize. I hope nobody fell asleep. The presentation opened the discussion on our experience and on our experiential understanding of heritages of trauma and death, and attempted to draw a not so straight line between the metaphors we use to grieve, the cognitive architectures that help us rationalize and conceptualize cultures of death and trauma, and the material architectures we use to commemorate such events. The persistence of the bodily and cultural references is worthy of our attention, not only as practitioners, as designers, but also as educators, you know, so in the design studio, have a more conscious, you know, a more being able to appreciate the power of the metaphor, you know, and where it comes from, where it stems from. Two things that, you could take with you, if you wish, from this dark, dissonant, and a bit disorientating presentation, is that primary metaphors are not language phenomena. They're thinking devices shaped by our bodily experiences. They're reflected in our language, and as such, they should be seen as mediums of empathetic design. So, and we don't explore that academically enough. We don't appreciate that, you know, we don't look into that, we don't investigate that. And the presentation also brings to our attention the possibility for a paradigm shift in commemorating architectures, the possibility for a movement from theatrical, performative, discursive interpretations of heritage to a model that sees culture, as a maze. and treats it in a similar manner. And I'll say a few more sentences on that, and its possibilities. Heritage as a maze, as a rhizome, an ecology, a network that expands in space and in time, allows us to consider how deeply interconnected are cultures of conflict and trauma with cultures of reconciliation and pride, cultures of death with cultures of life. The maze also reminds us that the culturally significant may not be strictly delineated, but essentially interconnected with what is often classified as worthless or insignificant. Such metaphorical mappings support more inclusive, responsible, and inquiring forms of engagement. The maze leaves room for playful and opportunistic synergies and allows us to recognize that the precious and the mundane, life and death, memory and forgetfulness hide at the same locations. Thank you very much. I think we have to wake up the people at the other room. Okay. Let's close this and return to the video situation. So thank you very much, Dimitra. I think it was not disorienting at all, I have to say. I have some thoughts, but before I start mumbling, let me see what thoughts other people have. Any questions? Or clarifications if they sound more easy, or...
For a question, clarification. First of all, thank you very much. It was amazing.
Nice to see you again.
I would like to watch it again, if possible.
We are recording it, so it's going to be on YouTube.
Definitely. The idea of that you mentioned of maybe, that's my reflection, and then maybe I get some part of it wrong, or you can correct me as well. The metaphors are cognitive as opposed to iconic, if you like. So is that the Jewish Museum by Eisenman is nothing to do with icon. It has to do with, if you like, index, as opposed to some of the architects that use metaphors like the bird being the freedom by Calatrava, which I suppose got it wrong completely. So I don't know. I wanted to.
A new domain.
I wanted you to kind of reflect on the idea of, well, metaphors are displacement of reality. In that sense, for instance, referring to Eisenman's project, that actually the morphology, the geometry of the mass, with this undulation, with all these tilting, changes, your body and makes you feel a bit uncomfortable, makes you maybe empathize. So my basically question is, are these metaphors creating homogeneous over heterogeneous space? And that is a kind of a question that I always was wondering, that is Eisenman trying to create heterogeneous space? And as he always talks about, he wants to create homogeneous space. And that is something that I would like to reflect on it, and maybe from the first part of my question or my remark, that you can disagree or agree.
Well, I think that it's less a matter of agreement or disagreement. First of all, we're reading into people's work here, and the tool here is that we try to be a bit more conscious about the use of metaphors in a way. I'm seeing things, some of them are manifested in the architect's, statements, others are not. So Ajay, for example, does not he himself speak about the maze, does not use the actual word. It's the images that he uses that I refer to. And again, the argument is not, I understand why iconic comes into the discussion, but in order to be more clear myself, I'm saying that, metaphors is not a game of language, it's a game of being, is about how we experience things, and this is so culturally contingent that it creates repeating, design strategies and design models that pop up, and we in order to be able to see them, if somebody looks, for example, at Foster and Partners proposal and Zaha Hadid's, proposal, and the other shortlisted entries, there's always a subterranean passage. There's always a cavern, where we experience as a team. There's always an individual return, if you wish, to the surface, to light, and that's a tendency. That's a design tendency that we won't challenge unless we identify it. So Eisenman, I don't know if there was a similar process through which, you know, he and Sarah came to the maze, you know, proposal in Berlin, to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, but definitely, you know, they must have been aware of the playful nature of it in a way. They must have been aware of the vagueness, you know, even finding the entrance in that space is a tricky part. For those, I don't know if you have visited the space yourselves, you know, that public, you know, place. If you don't know where you're going, it's very easy to get confused in an urban game in a way, and don't realize, you know, that this is a space of contemplation, if you wish, which is the main critique that the project has received. However, you know, it's a narrative. I mean, if somebody stands outside of it, has the luxury, it is a luxury to be able to stand outside of it, you start to realize that it liberates you, and it has a liberating aspect into it, and you're able to approach, you know, the same events, you know, with a less sense, not a sense of guilt, if you wish. So a different type of contemplation, a different type of shock as well. I mean, when you come to realize where you are. For me, the interesting thing about the maze metaphors in design is that they kind of embrace the fact that heritages of pride and heritages of guilt, you know, trauma and you know, progress or whatever, they're actually lying in the same locations. So the same stories, you know, the same events, you know, and while the previous attempts have a black and white approach to history and memory and heritage, you know, the maze kinds of, it doesn't let you adopt it in a way. In every corner, you can you know, detract, you know, to something which is very burdenous or something that is quite lightweighted. That's why I find it so interesting as a scheme, as a design schema. I don't think I've answered Haya, but
one thing that I don't know if I can.
Of course.
Continue on that, but the idea that the project as a metaphor stops communicating in a way that, if you look at it, of course, Eisenman's work, it doesn't say anything to do with the building itself until you are in it. Then you experience it. It doesn't say that there is no form that says that this building or this mass has something to do with the Holocaust. So it kind of stops that communication until you go there and you feel. And actually, when you go there, you don't know where you are until you are there.
Until you're part of it.
Yeah, you're part of it. So it stops communication until you are there to discover the code or the notation that he calls it, to get, oh, that's what he means. So that moment that he stops communication until you get eager to go and discover that, I think that I find it, with your answer, I find that quite interesting. So yeah, in part, actually, was a good answer.
But it's a contested topic anyway.
Yeah,
I mean, because the majority of these competitions actually ask for a place, you know, of contemplation, you know, where you feel the burden of history, where you feel actually, you know, all the responsibility that you need to take, the collective responsibility that you need to take for the atrocities that have happened and so on. So they're very descriptive and prescriptive about it. The question is how we engage with that experience, you know, as architects, and how metaphors helps us, because it's very easy to stage that space. You know, we've seen it. It's a safe solution to stage that space, you know. Under those times.
Sorry to step in, but because
You have to leave that.
we have to coordinate with the use of the space later on. There's another question by Charlie Drozinski. Yes, I will out you. You cannot get away with just the initials here, Charlie. So he says, thank you for the lecture. It was very interesting. Do you think that the approach to thinking through these ideas using architecture is to some degree guided by the way in which architectural competitions or conventional ways of representing projects are set up? For instance, the need for a 3D visual asking for a collective way of thinking about this individual passage space, etc.
Well, I would say yes, although I think that there are people close to me that may be more, you know, more capable of answering the question. I would say yes. First of all, you know, in terms of digital representation, I think when you always focus on the singular experience, the individual's experience, is much more easy, you know, to communicate that, you know, and to build some kind of empathy with that. The collective experience is something that we we usually, refer to it to talk about spaces of play and joy, educational spaces, playgrounds, whatever. We rarely see it coming together, as main renderings, in such occasions. But yes, definitely the competition call, and the site itself, has an impact. It's not just a conceptual game, it's a conceptual game embedded in a particular location. I hope that answers the question. Sophia, would you like to say something more about
I just wanted to give a face to the people on the other side of the computer, some of them, which are these 20 people here. Hello, everyone. Okay, we will wrap this up and we will probably continue a more personal discussion here. Thank you very much to Annie and I know your name.
And apologies for the interruption.
Leticia, for bearing with us. And thank you to all of you who were online. And we'll see you at the next talk. I cannot promise when it's going to be, but see you later. Bye-bye.
Have a nice afternoon. Thank you for having me.